Good afternoon and welcome to Hymning Through Lent. This is our first in the series for 2022. I'm glad to be talking with you again informally about some of the hymns that are sung in our congregation and some that may not be familiar, and a little bit about the background. We're going to start with a composer, an Englishman, who wrote two hymns that are in our current Episcopal hymn book, the 1982 hymn book, and his name is Thomas Ken. He was born in 1637 and he lived until 1711. He was orphaned as a child and was reared by his older sister, and he first was a scholar at Winchester College and then moved to Oxford University, where he earned a bachelor's degree in 1661 and a master's degree in 1664. So at this time, I'd like you to see a photograph, or not a photograph, but a painting of Mr. Ken, Thomas Ken. He was then taken into orders in the Anglican Church, became a priest. Do we have the photo? Okay. So there he is in his Anglican vestments. He was working during the time of the English monarch Charles II and James II. And he was appointed by Charles II as the chaplain to Mary of York, who was married to the Prince William of Orange, who was a Netherlands prince. The following year, he became the chaplain to Charles II, and soon after he was made the chaplain, he was asked to vacate his house so that Charles' long-term mistress, Nell Gwyn, could appear on the scene and live in his house. He refused to do this, but Nell Gwyn was quite a character of the period that's known as the Restoration, and she was a celebrity on the stage and was an actress of great charm and evidently ahead of the curve in terms of feminist activities. One of the first to be on the stage as a woman, and she was a comic actress and very, very popular at the time. She was the mistress of King Charles for quite a while, and he actually fathered two children with her, and one was Charles Beauclerc and the other was James Beauclerc. Charles Beauclerc was later made the Earl of Burford, and then after that, subsequent to that, the Duke of Albans. So on the more polite side of the bedspread, we still have Thomas Ken working as a faithful member of the church, and he was appointed the Bishop of Bath and Wells. And now we're going to see a picture of the Cathedral of Wells, which before we do that, we're going to go back and see Nell Gwyn. She was very photogenic, and you can see perhaps why King Charles was quite taken with her, and she was anxious to spread her charms around wherever it did the most good. Now, back to people who were in the Anglican cloth, we have Thomas Ken as the bishop of the cathedral in Wells. It's a beautiful building in the style that's known as Perpendicular Gothic. And we see a picture of it, perhaps coming up on your screen. And you may see a second photo coming up on the screen. And in this one, we see the view from the bishop's garden. There's a moat around the bishop's palace, and swans and ducks float along there happily. I remember being in the city of Wells, and I was particularly interested in seeing that cathedral. Across the street from the cathedral was a house that had a plaque on it, which I read with great interest, because it said this house had been the home of a citizen of Wells by the name of William Penn, who went to America and became a prominent citizen there. So I got quite a charge out of that and was glad to see it. Thomas Ken remained the chaplain to King Charles II and was there at his deathbed. Charles II was succeeded by James II, who was in support of the Roman Catholic faith, and the Anglican Church had been in sway now for several years, since Henry VIII, and of course through the time of Elizabeth I, but then in between was Mary of Scotland, Queen of Scots, also known as Bloody Mary. And when Charles was succeeded by James, James tried to put through a resolution. It was called the Declaration of Indulgences, which was on the surface supposed to give support to those of Protestant faith who were not Anglicans but were more unorthodox and breakaway. But actually, the whole thing was intended to encourage them to become Roman Catholics. So this was not very successful. He tried a couple of times to have it put through, but 6 bishops, including Thomas Ken, signed a petition and posted it, published it and posted it against this. As a result of that, they were imprisoned. So after a while, they were acquitted of this and set free. Now, we also have a picture here of the Lady Chapel of Wells Cathedral that is worth taking a minute to see. It's very beautiful, happens to have wonderful acoustics too. It's a good room in which to sing. After his stint in the Tower of London, Thomas Ken, went back to his work at Winchester Cathedral and at Wells, and he also, during that time, experienced the change of the reign of the monarch when Prince William from the Netherlands came and ousted the Charles II. He fled for his life, and William and Mary were put on the throne, husband and wife, co-regents. And we have in Virginia a college named after them, the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. During this time, Ken still kept his allegiance to King James, although I wonder personally why he didn't give his allegiance to Mary of York, since he had formerly been her chaplain. But as a result of that, he spent the remaining 20 years of his life in prison, or a part of it in prison, and he was deprived of his office. Then he spent the 20 remaining years in retirement. He liked to sing hymns. He was a small man in terms of stature, but he was quite an orator, it is said, and had a very compelling personality. He was very concerned about the spiritual life of the scholars at Winchester College. So he created and published a manual for prayers for the use of scholars of Winchester College. In this, he encouraged his scholars to be sure to sing the morning and evening hymns in your own chamber devoutly, remembering that the psalmist, upon happy experiences, assures you that it is a good thing to tell of the loving kindness of the Lord early in the morning and of his truth in the night season. So these 2 hymns were included in a subsequent publication of his manual of prayers. I'm going to play the first one. The morning hymn is one that was written by Thomas Ken, and then the tune was written by another person, and I'll come to him in a minute. But first, I'd like you to hear the tune itself. I think we'll see the hymn coming up on the screen at this point.
Any slots in our future?
In a minute. So here is the hymn tune itself. Now, I want you to pay close attention to the words in it because they were written by Thomas Ken, and the tune was written by Francois Hippolyte Barthélémon some years later, but it's the one that's always been associated with them. And Barthélémon was a French violinist, orchestra leader who migrated to London, and he wrote operas, ballets, some concertos, and this particular hymn tune. I'll play it one more time, and Hymn 11, and pay close attention to the words of this verse, verse 1. I'll refer to verse 1 in just a minute, but I want you to notice also that the last verse, verse 4, is a doxology, the one that we're used to singing on Sundays. Praise God. The thing that grabs my attention whenever I encounter this hymn is the second phrase of the first hymn. The first phrase, awake my soul, and with the sun thy daily stage of duty run. Shake off dull sloth, and joyful rise to pay thy morning sacrifice. Sloth is a word we don't hear too much anymore, but it was considered one of the capital or deadly sins by the Catholic Church in medieval years, and there was a painting of it, which is going to come up on your screen, that was by Hieronymus Bosch, or it's attributed to him. And this painting is actually a circular painting with the panels going in a circular fashion, describing the 7 deadly sins and the 4 last things. Well, in this painting, you will see an individual in a chair who is reclining, has a pillow, hands folded, feet relaxing, cats on the floor, not interested in doing anything except staying in that chair, but being encouraged by a figure, it looks somewhat like a nun, to become active. The dictionary defines sloth as a habitual disinclination to exertion, indolence, laziness. Now here's another example of sloth that I think is more endearing. It's also a slow-moving, arboreal, tropical American animal of the family Edentate. And this is an interesting word in itself. Edentate is an order of New World mammals that are characterized by the absence of incisors and canines in the arrangement of their teeth. The animals that are in this group are armadillos, sloth, and the South American anteater. So they're basically herbal in their eating, and I think that the word edentata, the biological category, is interesting because it has the word Eden in it, as in the Garden of Eden, and I wonder if it's a reference to being before the fall and before people were thinking about the bloody tooth of the tigers and eating meat and being canine eaters. So in leaving this, I think it's appropriate to have a fond farewell to a friendly face who's there eating a leaf. Another hymn by the same composer is in the hymn book at page 43, number 43. It's under the category of evening hymns, and also subtitled Compline, which is one of the 7 canonical hours, and it was sung following Vespers, and quite often it was sung, which meant that it was usually sung after dinner. This particular hymn is one that, again, written by Ken. One is called the morning hymn, the other one the evening hymn that he advised his students to consider and to sing every day, is one that again ends with the same benediction, or doxology rather. Praise God from whom all blessings flow, on the 4th verse. Here's the tune. The tune was written by the English composer Thomas Tallis, who lived during the reign of Elizabeth I. And this particular tune predates the writing of the hymn, but it works beautifully with those words. And this tune is quite often sung in a round, or in canon, as it's technically described. That would be in which one voice starts the part, and one measure later, a second voice can sing the same first notes, and they keep playing tag as they go through the piece, and a third voice can join a measure later, and a fourth one. But here it is, this is how it works with 2 voices. So the first voice that ends just sustains its tone while the second voice catches up. There's another setting of it that Tallis did that is from the English Psalter. The Psalms were sung most often in Latin, but at one point during Tallis' lifetime, he worked with an English author, and they set them to the English language. He used 8 different tunes, and these, or tones, they were set for the various psalms, and I have a setting of it here for Psalm 67. The language is very interesting because it's Old English, and I won't go into that at the moment. That has its own thing. But the tune is described as mild. It says, the 8th goeth mild in a modest pace. Well, it's based on this tune. It's in a different key. It's in the key of B flat. And as you look at this on the screen, you'll be able to see the hymn of the 43, the All Praise Thee, My God, this night. But here it is transposed, and as it would have been sung to Psalm 67. Every phrase of that particular melody is repeated in the Psalm version. In addition to that, he writes it in 4 parts, and each part will sing part of the phrase, and then it will repeat part of the phrase, although the words are going on, and then it will also sing words that are not part of the melody, while another voice is singing the melody. If it were created on a graph, it'd be very interesting to see each segment of this piece perhaps giving a color code, and to see how each fragment of the piece moves from one voice to another, to another, to another, to another, to another. And it's hard to follow with the eye until you get used to this. But here's how it starts. The tenors sing the melody at first. The sopranos have some of the melody immediately after. The bass and the altos are singing other notes that are part of the harmonies. And then these are passed back and forth again. You will also hear a couple of notes that sound perhaps like wrong notes. That's part of the mode in which this was written. The harmony, the scale pattern was slightly different. But I'm going to play the setting of it and as how it was set for Thomas, how Thomas Tallis said it for the singing of the psalm. I'm most anxious to do this with the choir at some point. It'll probably be the most fun with the singers. But here's how it goes. So you'll hear fragments of this piece again and again going through this piece, going through it. It's not always in the melody. The melody is not always in the top voice, is what I meant to say. Here's how it starts. The tenors. And the other voices with it. So that's another setting of that hymn, and it's one of the two hymns of Thomas Ken that we have in our hymn book. Now, moving along to a hymn 675 in our hymnal, we have a hymn, "Take Up Your Cross," the Savior said. The author of the hymn text was Charles William Everest, and he lived between 1814 and 1877. He wrote the words when he was only 19. It was subsequently modified a little bit by some more mature poets, but it's based on Jesus' exhortation to the multitude and to his disciples in the 8th chapter of Mark, verse 34, about the necessity of taking up one's cross and following Jesus. The text is particularly notable for the fact that this is an American text that was included in an English hymnal by the year 1858. It's a kind of reversal. We're usually inheriting all of the texts from England. The tune name is called Bourbon, and that will bring up various associations for various people. And it can be a very tasty association. Yes. Freeman Lewis wrote the tune, and he lived between 1780 and 1859. And this tune appeared in a 19th century collection in rural American tunes called The Beauties of Harmony. It was published in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania in 1814. And it was written in what they call shape note hymns. The hymns were written in shape note tunes. And that means that the notes, instead of being normal ovals that are filled in solid black, or some of them are open as half notes, and having the stems that we're used to seeing, instead they were written with squares, triangles, and various shapes and positions, which was a way for people who didn't read music to identify the pitch with that. And they were sung usually in unison, sometimes in parts, as the people became more used to it. And they had great gatherings in rural areas of people singing these tunes. The tune name Bourbon is possibly from an association with Bourbon County in Kentucky, which was the home of the Cane Ridge Revival that was in 1801, and that marked the beginning of the Second Great Awakening in America, which was a very spiritual evangelical revival. Now, the thing that's interesting about this tune is that it's based on a pentatonic scale, and that's something that music theorists love to talk about, and it means that it's not the usual kind of scale that we know of most Western music, but it's one that has only 5 notes in the scale within an octave instead of having 7 notes, which is the normal for more modern music. Here, for example, is the C major scale. There are 7 notes, with the first note being repeated at the top, which means that we have an 8th one. So that's a C major scale, and it has a series of steps. If you divide that into equal intervals, there are a total of 12 semitones. And I could talk about this for a while, but I won't. It's sort of like having 360 degrees in a circle. You have to have 360 to complete the circle. An octave will have 12 semitones, whether it's a very low-pitched octave or it's a very high-pitched octave. It will have 12 semitones. In addition to that, there are quarter tones, there are microtones. But there are 7 notes in most of the scales that we know today. Here's another in D. 7 notes plus the first note being repeated means 8, octave. In a pentatonic scale, there are 5. That's one of the pentatonic scales. Here is another one that correlates to the black notes on the keyboard. If you play all the black notes in an octave, you get this. You have a whole tone, and then a whole tone plus a half semitone, and then whole tone, steps in it. And those 5 steps only, those 5 notes only are used. And they can be transposed to different. And all of the notes in this particular hymn are based on this scale that has and I can actually sustain all of those notes and play the notes that are in the melody. The notes in the melody apply to any of those 5 notes and nothing else. There are no chromatic harmonies. It sounds something like this. Now, the tune has been harmonized in our hymnal, and we're actually going to sing this coming Sunday. It's our closing hymn. It has great words, and here's how it sounds with its harmony. There's another version of the harmony in the hymnal with different words, and it has a little more of the pentatonic quality about it. This is it. These pentatonic scales were also used in music of antiquity. They go back actually to the Greek times. They used to tune their kithara or kitora, which is a lyre, to the five-note, the pentatonic scales, and is also very present, interestingly enough, in the music of Native American Indians. And if you hear a lot of this and hear used in various ways, you will be able to hear the effect of what you might hear from that music. It's also very prevalent in the music of the East, in Asia, particularly Southeast Asia. The Javanese music is very much influenced by it, and music in Korea and in Japan use various forms of the pentatonic, that is the five-note scale, as well as a lot of folk songs in the Middle European music. Now, going to our last hymn of the day, we have a spiritual, one that we sing that is one of the most loved hymns of the Christian church. And let us break bread together on our knees. These tunes and words were sung, it was part of an oral tradition. They were not written down, and for many, many years. So they sometimes would have slight variations in them as they went from one area to another, and sometimes the words would be changed slightly. But this particular tune seems to have a trace. We seem to be able to trace where it came from. And we're going to have a map come up, I think, on the screen that shows you the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor. This tune is particularly associated with the stretch along the eastern, southeastern part of the United States and the coastal area, especially of South Carolina. And this is known as the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor, named after the dialect. The first time that the words of this and the music were recorded, were written down, appeared in a student's book in the Penn School of the St. Helena Island off the coast of South Carolina. And that's back in the late 19th century. There was an African-American composer by the name of John Rosamond Johnson who arranged the first solo version of this beautiful hymn. And he arranged it in such a way that in a climactic way, he raised the last verse, the third verse, an octave higher. And it's become a tradition to sing it that way. And there were many singers of African-American singers who sang this in concerts in various parts throughout the United States and throughout the world, who made this form of singing it very popular. And some of these were Paul Robeson and Roland Hayes and the great Marian Anderson. So another aspect of this, and when scholars have tried to analyze and think about the text and what this means about falling on my knees and facing the rising sun, they think that there is some distinct connection there to history of perhaps early faiths, when people faced Jerusalem to pray. When the Israelites were in captivity in Babylon, they turned in whatever direction it was from Babylon, I'm not sure, but they always turned to face the east, to face Jerusalem. And there are Islamic prayers in which they are exhorted, and they always face the east. But there is another aspect of it in which Christ is considered the light. That's another aspect of which facing the light of Christ is another element of that. There was a scholar by the name of Horace Clarence Boyer